Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Visual Studio Remote Office Hours. I'm your host, Mads Christensen, and today we're going to talk about something that I have been very curious about for the past 10 years of working at Microsoft, and that is, what's it like when you are brand new program manager at Microsoft coming straight from college? And it's very interesting to me because I've never had sort of that college experience. I know there's a lot of my colleagues that haven't had that. But of course, I think the majority have. And there's no one better to help me understand and maybe help you understand how that is like than one of our newest employees on the Visual Studio team coming straight from college. Kira, hello, how are you doing?
Hey, Mads, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'd love to talk about college and coming to Microsoft.
Awesome. Maybe you can start by giving a brief introduction, like who are you and what college did you go to and what's your story? How did you get to Microsoft?
Yeah, so my name's Kira Weiss. I'm a PM on the Visual Studio team on the platform core team specifically. So I went to Claremont McKenna College in Southern California, and I majored in computer science at Harvey Mudd College and then art as well. I had art minor. So the computer science part definitely brought me into the tech area. I started out as more of a software engineer. That's what I interned as for 2 different summers, and then realized that I was more interested in PM work. So like the whole end-to-end process, like getting to talk to users, all of that stuff was really intriguing to me. So I applied for PM roles my senior year. And then I ended up at Microsoft, and now I'm working on the Visual Studio team, which is cool because I went from sort of being a developer or almost a developer to working on products for developers.
All right, very cool. So I know that a lot of the people that come straight from college to Microsoft, they have in the summers between their college years, they intern. Have you done any of that?
Yeah, so I didn't actually intern for Microsoft like some people have, but I interned so when I was a sophomore, I interned at a company called TechCrunch, which is a tech news publication. And that's really what taught me all about the tech industry. I was on the audience development team, so I basically read like between 50 to 100% of the articles and then would write copy for Facebook and Twitter and stuff. But just in reading all those articles, I learned so much. And that was a year-long one, so that was a lot of learning. And then I also did 2 internships as software engineers. One was at a cybersecurity company in Israel, and then the other was at a company called Intuit. And both of those gave me a really cool technical understanding. And actually at Intuit, I was also able to do a small PM project because I had worked a lot with the PM, and I was like, okay, I think I might be interested in this, but I'm not sure. So he let me do like a really small user study in addition to the coding work. And that's how I sort of came into the PM area.
Okay. So I want to drill in a little bit to your computer science classes because those are things that I never had. And so how did they prepare you? Because even though you've not been an engineer at Microsoft, you've interned in engineering, like what you were mentioning. So how do you feel like those computer science classes helped you eventually land your job at Microsoft?
Okay, I think the computer science classes were super important. So I went to Claremont McKenna, but like I said, I majored at Harvey Mudd, and Harvey Mudd is particularly focused on engineering. So they have a really good setup, and there's basically 3 core classes that you take, like the intro classes that anyone can take. And then there's 4 sort of like heavy duty classes, like systems and algorithms and logic and computability and those sorts of guys. And those were the harder classes for me, definitely, but they also give you a really strong background in those areas. And then you also get to take electives and other things. I would say one of the coolest parts of my computer science classes, so not every school does this, but Harvey Mudd has this program called Clinic. And basically you go in teams of 5 students your whole senior year and you work for a company. So I worked for a company actually in Seattle called Indeed. And we basically did exploratory machine learning for them and came up with a bunch of different kinds of models to help them predict certain things. But so basically you have meetings with them every week, like one person on the team kind of acts as a PM and then other people have different roles. So this was sort of like the link between the academic world and the real world, because you're also working with a professor and kind of trying to do any research you can in addition to those projects. So that part was really cool. I would say specifically also for my job at Visual Studio, because we're working for developers, a lot of the CS like sort of background courses and systems and things that weren't super relevant to me at the time are now really relevant. Like I think about things like build and solution load and debugging and all of that like all the time now, but in an academic sense, it was more project based. So it was less of like the whole big picture of how the computer works and all of that. So that stuff is definitely more relevant to me now. But I'm glad that I had those like sort of strong background in that, because it's helping me to get onboarded quickly here.
So that sounds a little bit like those computer science classes that you had was more like foundational. When you're mentioning how fast can Visual Studio load a solution and performance and all this sort of stuff, that your understanding of that from a technical perspective has a foundation in those classes. Do I get that right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So, all right. So I know that Microsoft do these, they go out to colleges and they do these sort of hiring rounds to basically recruiting events where they recruit, I think both to get interns to start at Microsoft, but also to have, people basically get a job at Microsoft, and they do all the interviews there on campus. Did they do that with you?
Yeah, so I had a slightly different recruiting track than that one. But basically, so for the first part, there's a Microsoft recruiter that's connected at our campus, and she came out and then schedules interviews with basically, I think, as many students as they can fit in for like sort of a first round screener. And it's like a 30-minute interview. Mine was just like talk through a case. So it's kind of like to evaluate first round. And then from that point, I think there's two routes that people normally go. Either you can kind of come to Microsoft and interview with a couple teams and come here for the day and they'll fly you up. I ended up going to Grace Hopper, so I was able to do my next round of interviews there. So at the conference, we kind of like went into a back tent and then like interviewed, and then I heard from them after that.
So hang on. So Grace Hopper, the conference that's in, is it Austin, Texas?
It was in Orlando, Florida. I think it changes some years, but this was in 2019. No, 2018.
So you did your interview for the job at a conference where you just kind of stepped outside with a recruiter or a hiring PM from the Visual Studio team, or who was it?
No, so, yeah, it sounds funny when you say it like that. Yeah, and I'd also had a red eye the night before, so I was so tired. But no, so it's pretty like formal or organized at the conference. Each company has their like area, their tents, and then it was there was 3 interviews. None of the people that I interviewed with were actually from Visual Studio. Not sure about the division, if they were in the developer division, but they basically just like interviewed us and talked to us. We ran through some cases. And then something that I said I was really interested in was sort of being involved with the users and the design thinking process. I don't know, I can talk more about that if people aren't familiar with that, but sort of like asking the users what their pain points are and then solving from there, as opposed to like coming up with ideas and implementing them and then seeing if they're relevant. And that's sort of a lot of like tech companies follow that pattern, but it's somewhat of a newer one. And the developer division is known for sort of their work with the users and sort of doing what the users want, not necessarily what they want. And so I think that's how I got paired here, because that's sort of what I talked a lot about in my interview. But honestly, I'm not sure. I don't think there was anyone from Visual Studio.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually pretty funny. I don't know if people are aware of this, but in developer division at Microsoft, where the Visual Studio Code, and the Azure SDKs and a bunch of developer tools are created, we're kind of used as best practice for doing customer research and stuff like that, which is interesting. And it's kind of being replicated in other teams around Microsoft. That's what you're referring to, I take it here.
Yes. And yeah, it was funny because that's what I was most excited about, but I didn't really realize that about the developer division. And then before I started, they sent me 2 books to read. And one of them was actually about developer division. And I hadn't really realized. And it was like a published book. Like I wasn't expecting that when I opened it. And I was like, oh, no way. This is what I'm joining.
Was that the one by Travis and Monty?
Yeah.
Okay, I forget the name, but that's a fantastic book for anyone interested in doing customer research and how to help inform and shape your product based on customer research. Oh, you got it right there.
Yeah, I have them. So there's two of them.
Okay.
One is the customer-driven playbook, and one is the customer-driven culture. But yeah, I recommend those as well. They're cool.
Awesome. Well, that's a pro tip for the viewers right there. All right. So all this happened at a conference. You got your interview rounds and all this sort of stuff. But it was not like you were done with your senior year. Like this was during your senior year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how had you started exams yet or anything? Were you close to being done with school?
No. So this was actually last fall, actually over a year ago now, or about a year ago. And so this was in the first semester of my senior year, so definitely not close to being done. I wasn't even close to exams because exams are normally in December. But it was probably more around the time of midterms. I remember I had to get one moved because we had to fly to Florida for Grace Hopper, which was like kind of a big trip. And that part was stressful. Yeah, I guess also the recruiting process, I feel like a lot of college kids are familiar with it, but it definitely takes a lot of time. Like I kind of think of it as another class when you're doing all your classes, and it's just in the fall usually, or it depends. It can go to the spring depending on the company. But it definitely takes a lot of time, especially because for software engineering roles, for example, you have to do a lot of like coding question practices. So there's like websites or books that you can do to sort of prep for those, or like HackerRank is one that's online that I would like try to do problems like every day or a couple of weeks, something like that, to prepare for interviews. And then for PM interviews, it's completely different. It's more like walk through a case or solve a problem. They kind of vary a lot, or they can be super abstract. Like the classic one is how many golf balls can you fit in an airplane? And so there's like a lot of different ways that they evaluate you, and it takes a lot of time to sort of prepare and get ready for that. I think it's easier when you focus on just your few favorite companies, because then you can kind of be more passionate about those specific products or specific ideas, tools, concept, whatever it is. But it definitely takes a lot of time with school. I do think like at our school, at least, we had a really cool career services group that helped us, and they're actually the ones that allowed us to go to Grace Hopper as well, and like got the tickets and the flights and stuff. So that was really exciting as well.
Oh, so your school basically takes like an active role in this whole recruiting part.
Yeah.
Do you think, is that just a few universities or colleges, or is it like widely all over the US or maybe the world? Do you have any idea?
I don't. If I had to guess, I would guess it's a little bit easier for smaller schools. My school was pretty small, so we were kind of lucky that we get more access to that sort of thing. I do know that like a lot of schools, bigger schools or tech schools at least, will have like specific recruiters for that school, and they'll like focus and work with the school to set up interviews and things like that and find candidates. I don't know. I think it varies a lot across the world and school to school.
So through college, did you have a job like as a barista at Starbucks or something like that?
So I didn't have a job like that. Okay, well, first I'll preface with I played lacrosse, which was a big time commitment. That was a spring sport, so that was basically my whole springs were dedicated to lacrosse. Then I would also say I did internships in the summer, and usually that was kind of how I tried to fund the rest of my year. I mentioned that I worked for TechCrunch, and that was a year-long one, so I worked at school remotely, reading all the articles and then posting them and stuff. And then I also worked for various on-campus things or like groups. So I worked for this institute called the Kravis Leadership Institute, and I was a social innovation consultant. So it sort of aligns with PM, where we were sort of trained to help people that had ideas and show them, if it was for a case competition or for whatever it may be, we kind of walked them through the process of how to turn that idea into something that was real. And then oftentimes it was for case competition. So we were essentially consultants for them. So that was more of my freshman and sophomore year, but that was a really cool thing. And then later on, I sort of noticed how that connected with PMing. It's a very similar sort of process that you follow with a few slight differences. But yeah, I didn't work as like a barista or anything like that, but I definitely had jobs throughout college. They were just more oddball jobs, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of trying to figure out like if you went from like not having done much work and then go from school straight to like a full-time employee position, which I would assume would be pretty daunting. But before we get there, we got a question here from Gemma. She wants to know, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of transitioning from a programmer to a PM role?
Okay, I would say the most challenging aspect of transitioning from a programmer to a PM role. Well, okay, the first thing is that when I was a programmer, you really only see, or for at least like when I interned, I only saw the PMs and interacted with them in our Scrum meetings and maybe like a couple side meetings. So I never really understood what they were doing in all their other time. But like I had a general idea, but I didn't really understand. And so I think there's a lot of aspects of the job that I wasn't really aware of, and not that I like dislike them or especially like them or anything, but there was a lot of learning to do. It was a steep learning curve. There's a lot more writing than I expected with the PM role. So sort of things like specs and lots of emails and planning and stuff like that, which is really cool because you're kind of controlling the way things are going, which is a little different than as a programmer. Let's see, other challenging aspects. I think it's different in the sense is that it's a lot more of a people role than developing. For developers, at least when I interned, it was a lot more of like working at my computer and working with my immediate teammates versus as a PM, it's kind of like, okay, who can we involve and how can we get people to take ownership in this project? And so that part is definitely new if you haven't done it before. And that's something like my manager keeps showing me, which is really nice that we have like a good team here to show me these things. I guess in terms of tips for PM role, I would say the way that I see PMs is they kind of sit at the middle of design, engineering, and also business to a degree, or strategy. And so kind of having a little bit of experience in those different areas, or two of the three areas, and kind of knowing why you're interested in this role as opposed to one of those three roles was sort of, that's what I would see to be kind of important. Personally, I sort of, because I was CS and art, I feel like, and the intersection of that was actually my human-centered design class, or like UI, UX sort of things. I saw the design and the engineering world. I have a little bit less experience in business, but that's sort of what I'm hoping to learn in business strategy and stuff. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to look at the role, and it varies job to job a lot, but those are the three things that I kind of have focused on and want to get to know better. And by being in the middle of all three of those, it's a really sort of exciting role, and there's a lot happening at all times. So yeah, I think just kind of taking your interest groups and seeing where they fit into the process, and if PMing is the right role for you, I think that's a big thing and will be really helpful.
That was very insightful. Thank you. Good question there, Gemma. Okay, so you're when are you told that you're getting the job?
Let's see. I think last October, maybe November, somewhere around that time. It was like 2 weeks after Grace Hopper.
Okay. Oh, so that was pretty quick. That was a quick turnaround from interview to getting the. Did you get a phone call, an email? Like, how did that work?
It was a phone call. Yeah, and it was the recruiter that I'd worked with at school, so I was really excited. I was so excited. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. So it's like a person you kind of know a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so were you told, oh, fly to Redmond or to Seattle, or by this and this date? How did that then go from I have my job, I have a piece of paper or a phone call or whatever, to actually starting? What happened in between?
Okay, well, there was a pandemic, so that was a little thing. So basically, yeah, I committed to Microsoft and was super excited. And then I still kind of had, I think, like 7 or 6 months left of school. So honestly, in my mind, it was kind of on the back burner for a little bit. Like getting through school was the main priority. And then in February, so we went back for our second semester. And then in February, end of February, they were like, okay, everyone has to go home. And so I live So for Claremont McKenna, like most of the students, I think it's like 99% live on campus. So versus at a lot of other schools, seniors would live off campus. So my entire grade was just dispersed and went home. And so I went back to Danville, which is in Northern California, where I grew up, where my family lives, and then finished the semester online. And then I had like 3 or 4 months before I started Microsoft. So I was basically home for that whole time. It was kind of funny because I remember I emailed the recruiter like 2 different times and I was like, so do I still have a job? Like, is anything happening because of the pandemic? I was like pretty uncertain just because there was so much happening and there was all this news about some companies were rescinding offers, things like that. It turned out to be totally fine, which I'm very, very appreciative of. But yeah, so that was sort of the middle period. It wasn't too exciting. I was mostly just quarantining with my family, reading, doing all sorts of things like that. But that was the between period. And then so in August, so I'd met a few other girls that were also working at Microsoft, and we'd made plans to live together. And then the pandemic happened, and we were pretty unsure. We were like, do we move? Do we not move? Especially given that a lot of companies were going to be remote. At the end of the day, we were kind of like, okay, I think we should move. Even if we're exploring just outside parts of Seattle, like I think that would be worth it. And I was at home for a long time. So I was kind of ready to move. So we moved here, and then I haven't actually been to the Redmond campus yet. Or I went to the visitor center one time in January actually, but I haven't been there. Like a lot of my coworkers will talk about like building 18 and things like that. And like, I don't know what that is. But yeah, so I've been working remote here. But so far I love Seattle, so it's pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah, because starting in the pandemic must be kind of interesting, right? Because yeah, you've never seen the buildings. You don't have a lot of the same references, I guess, that when we're in meetings or chit chat about the cafe or the menu that we used to have for lunch or whatever that may come up sometimes, I guess. You've never even seen the cafe where we have lunch.
Nope.
Yeah. And so you started in August, was that your?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is a side note, but yeah, on the other thing about not being in the office, but I have so much alone time now in my house. And like when I was in college, I would almost always study with people. And so you kind of would hold each other accountable. But now there's a lot more like self-accountability to get my work done and stuff like that. That's a big shift from no work at all for like 6 or 7 months being at home to then going to 8 hours a day. That was a huge transition for me.
Yeah, I bet. So, okay. So you and your, I guess, roommates, you find a place to live in the Seattle area, and you move, and then a couple days later or something like that, you have a virtual start to your job. How did that go down?
Yeah, it was good. I had a pretty smooth transition. 2 of my roommates like didn't get their laptops for a couple days after their start date, and so they were just kind of like trying to go on their iPad, but you didn't have access to everything. I was able to get my computer and kind of get everything set up. It wasn't the like first 2 days weren't that hard. I think like the harder part of starting remote is sort of you miss a lot of the interactions that you would normally have with people. So like when I go into a Teams meeting, it's usually like maybe a couple minutes of chit chat at the beginning, but it's like it depends on the meeting, and then you kind of get straight down to business versus like in real life you would be sitting with these people, you would be getting coffee, getting meals, like walking through the hallways together. And so that's the part I most miss. And even though I have it's probably better that I don't have any context for that because I hadn't really worked at Microsoft before then, but I'm excited to get back to that eventually, hopefully. In terms of like the initial start, I think so my manager and like the team had worked together and they had a really structured to-do list. And some of those tasks were like, oh, explore the campus. Oh, go find this cafe, whatever. So I didn't get to do those ones. But the list really just helped me like kind of go through all the onboarding tasks. There's like a bunch of videos you have to watch. I tried to set up one-on-ones. My manager helped with that with people to kind of get to know the people I'd be working with. Yeah, they paired me with a buddy right away, Andrew. He's awesome. And so then he would also set up one-on-ones, and then I would just get to meet people from different teams. And a lot of the people that I had intros in those first few weeks are like the main people that I'm working with. So that was like a good start, just to have 30 minutes or however long to talk to them. I would say other things in terms of starting remote. Yeah, it's interesting getting to set your own hours. I think that was something that was like strange to me. Like, okay, if I wanted, I could work from 6 a.m. in the morning and then take a 3-hour break for lunch and then pop back on. I haven't done that as much, but it's nice to have that flexibility if I want to like go work out or I need to go to an appointment, something like that. So that part is actually a positive thing, I would say. But yeah, those are all different facets of starting remote as someone that hasn't started before.
Yeah, right. And you have to learn everything. I remember when first day on campus, I think was you go to like a new employee orientation event, NEO, we call it for short.
Oh yeah.
And that was like a full day of all the new employees. And I started in like November 8th, I think.
Okay.
And so I don't know if there's any season, like, I don't know if like, do we hire more people like in the fall than in the summer or whatever? I don't know. But I think there was like almost 100 people starting in Microsoft in Redmond starting that one day. And so we had this big conference room where like there was about 100 people and we were sitting there and all these speakers came in and explained things. And it was kind of entertaining and very informative. But of course, you didn't go through that event. Did you have a similar one that was virtual?
Yeah, so we had a virtual NEO. And I think we had probably a lot of the same speakers or like a similar experience. The one maybe downside is that it's a lot harder to meet people virtually. And so like I remember people on my team have been like, oh, I met some of my best friends at Microsoft like through NEO because you started at the same time. You can kind of like ping back and forth, like popcorn questions, etc. So I don't think I met as many people as maybe a typical employee would have at the new employee orientation. But there was definitely a few people I met, and then it helps that 2 of my roommates were also in the new employee orientation NEO. And so I kind of had them to ping back and forth with. But yeah, I definitely think that when we get back to the office, it'll be easier to meet new people. That would be like the one area that's a little weird. But I would also say on the flip side, there's a lot of sort of groups, events, teams to join. And there's like early in career and dev div. There's the Aspire program, which sort of sets up a bunch of talks and conferences for new employees. There's like the dev div women group, and they have mentor rings. So Microsoft's kind of doing everything they can, I think, to help people feel connected. The one thing is that like in-person connection, but I think they're doing as much as they can outside of that.
So it sounds like it was a pretty smooth beginning. Everything was set up for you. Do you remember it as being kind of smooth?
Yeah, I would say it was pretty smooth. It definitely, so I've talked to someone who started a week before the pandemic hit. And I think that would have been a lot more chaotic, especially just because at first there was so much uncertainty. But by the time we got to August, it was like pretty much, okay, we're working from home. Like, this is what we're doing. We're going to be productive. And there's also still like more flexibility and stuff. Like, I think working in a house and like a lot of people have their families and kids and stuff like that. I kind of like that because I think it's interesting to get to like see people's families, and it's a little bit more personal than it might be in the office. Although you might see like photos on someone's desk, something like that. But I think that part's fun. But yeah, I would definitely say I had a smooth transition. I think as smooth as can be. I mentioned the 8-hour days earlier. That was definitely the hardest part for me for the initial thing.
Like how so? Like 8 hours was a long time, or it was shorter than what you were used to in school, or?
No, well, so it was that I'd had 4 months off of no school, and at the end of school, so in terms of classes, I took like 4 classes a semester, and most of those are either like basically a total of 5 hours a week. And so you have a ton of breaks in between and stuff. And that was just kind of what I've been used to for the last 4 years. And then I also had 4 months of doing no work. And so coming to the 8-hour days, I was like, oh my gosh, I must work this long. And I think that's something that now I don't even notice it at all, but it seemed really long at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I remember whenever I've changed jobs in the past, like not moved within Microsoft, but like when I started Microsoft or started one of the other jobs I've had previously, I was very tired for like a month and a half. I felt very tired, like just exhausted, hard to get out of bed in the morning, kind of tired. It's probably just because it's new and a lot of information to take in, and you get like an overload or something. Did you experience that?
Yeah, I definitely think that. And there's days that I'm tired. I'm like, wow, there's so much new stuff. Like I need to just sit down and like digest all of this. I also think it's like just sort of a new lifestyle, like getting used to figuring out if I want to work out or what sort of things I want to do to be healthy, if I'm going to be cooking my meals or ordering food or things like that, because a lot of these things take a lot of time. And it's not stuff that I thought about in as much detail before because I had more time to do them. Yeah, I also think with the information overload, I've like personally learned when I'm working, if I'm like, say I'm working for like an hour straight or whatever, it usually is going to benefit me to have a 5-minute break and just like I always have a yoga mat over there and I'll just sometimes like go and like do some stretches just to like clear my head for a second and then come back to my desk. But I think that's like a really important thing. And I try to do stand up and walk around every couple hours. And so I think all of that helps with the sort of fatigue when you're like concentrating for a long time, like very intensely. But yeah, now I don't really notice the length as much, but definitely get tired when there's like a lot of back-to-back stuff or like urgent priorities, things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good tip about like making time to, take the time to do yoga or whatever it is, like get away from the screen for just a few moments. I do that with the guitar and play a little bit, and it's like, it's super helpful. Just kind of resets the brain a little bit.
Yeah.
So I am thinking like it must be I know for a lot of students, moving somewhere, it might be the first time they move to their own place outside campus, let's say, and Microsoft helped with that, right? You didn't have to like go find a house on your own, and they just left everything up to you. There was some sort of programs that Microsoft had that helped you. Is that right?
So I think they could have those programs. I didn't use those as much. They do have, so there is like relocation specialists that can kind of help, and especially for people. So I'm like renting a house. I don't own a house here. So we kind of were able to move in right when we got here. But I think if for people that are buying houses or need to renovate, things like that, if you're moving from abroad, things like that, they have a ton of support for that. It wasn't super difficult for the girls that I'm living with and I to find our place. We basically just like looked on Zillow, and we looked for a couple weeks and then settled on one and like talked to the landowner. But I think if we'd had been struggling, Microsoft would have had a ton of resources for that.
Okay. Yeah. So when I started, it was, we got some questions about this. That's why I'm going this direction here.
Okay.
We'll get to the questions in a minute. But when I started, I moved from abroad. I came from Denmark. And so they basically helped get movers and the movers came and actually packed down my kitchen and took my furniture and carried them down the stairs into like a big container they could ship. And it took like 2 months shipping or whatever because it was by boat. But they allowed me to have, I think it was 9 big moving, cardboard boxes for like clothes and stuff that I needed sort of immediately. And that went on an airplane. So that got there the same time I did, almost like a week later. And they set me up in temporary housing. I had a rental car for a month until I found my own. All this sort of stuff was there, but I think there might be a slight difference between moving from within the U.S. and relocating to Seattle than it is from abroad. Something like get a social security number, get a bank account, get insurance.
Oh, yeah.
All those sort of things are just, you already have those things, right? As an American. But we do have some questions here that I don't know if we can answer, but we can talk about it.
Okay.
Are there any opportunities for international students? Would love to know on what criteria do you think they hired you? What technical traits of yours, according to you, makes you a right fit for this? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would preface it by saying because I'm not an international student, I'm not sure that I'm the person to have the best insight into this. But in terms of like technical traits, I think having a computer science background was really important, especially because, like I mentioned before, our users are developers and coders. I think that it really makes a big difference if you understand the user as much as possible. Then the other thing is sort of just working with engineers and also designers, like having the art background, I don't think hurt me at all. And like knowing some of the tools they use, like Figma and a number of other ones. I think that was really helpful as well. In terms of other technical traits, I would say that querying languages and sort of understanding how to use data is a really important one for PMs. A big part of it, and this is something I've learned from like my manager and manager's manager, a big part of being a PM is getting people to work with you. And how do you get people to work with you? Through kind of telling a story with data. And so things like SQL and databases and that sort of stuff is really important. We have like a different tool, a tool called Kusto that we use. But data is like a very important part of the PM process. So I think that any like expertise in that area is going to help a lot. In terms of other technical traits, I think I would say that it depends sort of what sort of product that you want to work on. If it's Microsoft specifically and you want to work in dev, then just like a broad understanding is going to be helpful. And then you'll learn the specifics as you get to the job. I mean, I think the more technical depth you have is only going to help you in a place like this. In other roles, which I'm not sure if I should speak to them because I haven't been in them, but I think that the technical depth may be less applicable, but you do want to be able to communicate effectively with engineers and people that have a really deep understanding of code bases and products and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Mads might also know better other technical traits and tasks that would be beneficial to PMs.
Yeah, well, it's a hard question, right? So internationally, so the way that I think Microsoft does the whole recruiting from colleges is a very US thing, the way that Microsoft America does it, right? But there are other developer centers. So if you want to be an engineer, there's a big development center like scattered around India, Israel, Denmark, and other places around the world. And so in those countries, if you live in those countries or near those countries, you may want to reach out to those regional offices to see what the opportunities are there. I don't know how it works, to be quite honest. In terms of like good traits to have, I remember we used to, and we probably still do, these recruiting rounds for interns. So, and we actually fly the interns up, and they do like an interview. It's really like a full job interview when you want to intern at Microsoft. It's very interesting. And I was part of a couple of rounds of those interviews, and I remember there were some that we said no to, that we didn't think qualified to be an intern. And usually they were people it was like sort of more of an attitude type of thing. Like I remember there was one person saying that, the reason that he was even here to apply for an internship at Microsoft was actually because that his father thought it was a good idea. It's like, okay, that's not really that motivational, right? And so he ended up not getting the internship. And so I'm sure that there's a lot of like attitude and motivational tips and tricks you can do, right? So of course you have to be honest and actually be motivated to start the job, but talking about that and showing that off as well. Some passion is always good. So I know that that's a big part of what they're looking for. The passion is a big deal. All right. So I think we got there was like a bunch of questions about international that I think we're not really qualified to show, but maybe I should get a recruiter in and we should do a whole show on like how to get a job at Microsoft, just in general. That would be kind of interesting, both as an engineer or a program manager.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So when I started, I got all these emails about here's a link to all these different project pages, and also like here's a list of all these different abbreviations and acronyms that we use internally at Microsoft. These 3-letter acronyms or whatever. Did you get that too?
I didn't get a list, but okay. I think there's a website called the Glossary, and that's like it's one of my favorites in my taskbar on Edge because I used it so much when I first started.
Yeah. So there's all this sort of internal words and just different things that are just specific to Microsoft that you would have no way of knowing coming from the outside. And so you had to learn all that stuff, all these new words, all these new abbreviations and so on. Is that something that you're still like learning now, or is it something that was quick for you to adjust to? Or?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely still learning, and I think new ones pop up all the time that I haven't heard of. When I first started, there was so many that I had like a list. I actually still have a note stock of things that are unknowns to me. And then when I have time, I kind of go through and sort of see what's important for me to learn, what I need to. But then I'll just ping my manager all the time and be like, okay, so what is like NSAT, or like what are all these different things? And luckily, he's really quick at responding and will explain things. But there's a lot of acronyms, and I think that's like a normal with most large tech companies. But especially Microsoft's been around so long, and especially this division specifically, that it just goes way back.
Yeah. All right. So of course you had to ramp up and learn all these things, right? And part of it is also, but you were also thrown into your job immediately, I guess, like coming up with new features, getting hold of getting the backlog in control, and figuring out what the team should work on, right? The team of engineers that you're the program manager for. Was that kind of scary coming in, being brand new? You don't have the same, you're not as skilled as a developer as your development team are, right? Like no PM really is, I think it's fair to say. And so coming in and did you have to like get respect from them, or was it, how was that situation being sort of, you're going to tell them what to do to an extent or suggest to them what to do, but being that new person that didn't maybe have built up that respect yet? How was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I'm still kind of working on, is like working with developers. Yeah, they definitely have a lot more technical expertise than me. But I think that something is like, we're coming from very different points, and I don't think the important aspect is that I'm as technical as they are. I think like I'm more involved in sort of the whole user story and like representing the customer to the developers, versus like they have less interaction with the customers. So my goal is normally sort of to be the middleman and invite devs to as many like user interviews as I possibly can, or meetings that might be relevant, that aren't necessarily relevant to like their coding work, but are going to give them like the broader picture outside of just the bugs or the tasks that their teams are working on. I think that also, yeah, coming in as new, it's definitely like daunting, and I still find it to be a bit intimidating. But I think that at least on my dev team, everyone's super nice and also willing to sit down with me and learn, and either teach me or like go over things with me, and like ideas that I have that, yeah, those might not be feasible, or yeah, sure, like let's scope that and see what that would look like. So I think just as long as I'm willing to learn and they're willing to teach me, that was like the best part for me. I can't speak to every team, but that was sort of how it worked on my team. I think also I wouldn't really describe it as being in charge of them at all. I work a lot with the engineering lead sort of to prioritize what things we need to work on, but I've never been like, oh, you need to build this and this timeline or anything like that. I think that comes more from sort of their lead, who has more expertise and knowledge in the subject. And that's something I'm still sort of ramping up and learning for, and like getting to understand all the different projects and sort of features, bugs, the backlog. Yeah, there's a ton of things on there that we could be doing, but it's all about prioritizing what we should be doing. But yeah, I don't think that I've ever had sort of like a negative experience with any of the devs in any.
That makes a good point, because and we actually have a full show on some of this from September with Brady Gaster. So if you go back and look at that, you can see we talk about sort of the role of the PM and how it's kind of different than engineers. But it used to be that the program manager would be much more hands-on and be kind of the scrum master. So control like when each feature got built, what sprint to put it in and all this sort of stuff. And that's not the case anymore. Program managers are no longer scrum masters. We're no longer the owner of the backlog. It's more like engineering that has taken that on, and we're more, what are we? What are we doing if we're not managing we're not project managers? We don't manage the project and when things are happening and those sort of things. So what are we doing as PMs?
Well, I mean, I think something that I've been doing a lot since I got here is talking to customers. So I've probably had like over or been involved with over 30 or 40 customer interviews so far. And so personally, I'm working on the part of Visual Studio that's focused on loading your solution. And so when you load your solution, for a lot of circumstances, it loads really fast and people are really happy with it. But when you start to get into the customers that have large code bases, it can be really slow and sometimes like not as ideal as we would want it to be. And so I'm focusing on that, and we've built a number of features around that, but the feature that I'm focused on doesn't quite have the adoption that we're hoping it will have. It's called solution filters. And so I've been interviewing a number of customers first about like, have you heard of this? No. Okay, so we found it's not very discoverable. So then this feature that we think could help a lot of engineers, we're like, how do we make it more discoverable? So then we've been showing design concepts and kind of getting the points. And then it's like, okay, if people find this feature, are they going to use it? Are they going to continue to use it in their everyday lives? Or are they going to use it once or twice and then kind of drop off? And so then it's interviewing people that have tried it and seeing what were their reasons for dropping off, or then interviewing active users and asking them what would make this better. So I think a lot of it is sort of figuring out where the gaps are in the current system or what we currently have built, and then prioritizing what's going to make the most impact in order to fix that. So that's like a big area that I've been focused on. I would also go back to the point that the PM job varies so much team to team, person to person. Like I'm sure Mads is working on completely different things than that. There's a lot of different spaces that we can fit into. And it's also a lot of like looking at data and meeting with people and seeing who are the relevant stakeholders in the task that you're working on. It's kind of hard to say what we're doing because it varies so much day to day. There's a lot of meetings and working with other people, but like I couldn't exactly pinpoint what exactly all those are.
Yeah, right. That sounds very familiar. I think what you're describing is pretty accurate for a lot of the PMs on the Visual Studio team. So, but was this thing that you do as your job, as you're just describing, did you know what that was going to be like back when you started interviewing back in, did you say October or the fall of last year? Did they say, oh, a program manager does these things, and so you had that expectation, or was there a difference between the actual job and what you were kind of told through your interviews?
Okay, so I definitely think the actual job is different than I expected. I think that I had some ideas, but I didn't have a clear idea of like, oh, this is exactly what the job is going to be like. Some of it was I took this class called Human-Centered Design, which they like nicknamed it like Intro to PMing. And a lot of that has actually turned out to be incredibly relevant to what I am doing. It was like a lot of focus on user interviews and then like the whole design thinking process. I would say though, like I kind of tried to stay open-minded before and was like, okay, I know I'm going to be in this general realm and it's going to be related to this, but it could be anything. There's also like, I know other PMs that have started recently and like they basically exclusively work with their engineering teams. And it's a lot more focus on those teams and working with them versus like I work with my engineering team, but I would say I've been more focused on like the user interviews and the user stories lately. It's definitely not what I expected, but I didn't have a clear expectation. So I think that's probably why. It's that's what I would say to that. Hard question.
But is that because there's when you interview, you don't know, when it's a college interview, part of the college recruitment process, you don't know what team you're going to be on. You just hire into Microsoft and then they tell you, oh, this team over here needs a PM, so you go over there? Or do they say, hey, we have these openings, which one would you prefer? Like, I guess they can't, my point is that at the time of interview, they can't be precise because the way we PM in DevDiv might be different from the Windows organization or an Office or other parts of Microsoft. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And even so, I didn't know what team I'd be on or anything of that realm until the spring or maybe even summer. And when I did, they had first told me that I was going to be on a team that was more working with, it wasn't GitHub, but I was going to be essentially like working with GitHub the whole time. And so that's kind of what I had expected. And then like a couple weeks before I started, the manager reached out to me and he was like, oh, we switched it a bit. Like you're actually on Visual Studio now. But yeah, it was like I didn't know for a while what I was going to be on.
So you hit the jackpot. You were lucky. You got to the best team of all of Microsoft.
Yeah.
So what was the biggest surprise or the biggest gotcha things that that surprised you when you joined?
Ooh, biggest gotcha. I actually think what surprised me the most was how much sort of responsibility I was given so quickly. Like, I still am like, okay, I'm brand new. Like, I'm not sure, like, how am I running meetings and stuff? And a little bit of that is like my own imposter syndrome, which I think is somewhat normal for like a new grad. But I'm still like surprised sometimes. I'm like, are you sure you're going to trust me with that? Like, I'm pretty new here. And that was sort of immediate, that like I was sort of given responsibilities and tasks and goals, and like I'm accountable for the, like, there's no one else that it's going to come down to. And like my manager will obviously help out in any capacity, but it's definitely like the responsibility aspect like immediately surprised me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I think like when you say, imposter syndrome, because you're still relatively new, I don't think you should count on it ever going away. Let's ask people in the comments. Have any of you ever had your imposter syndrome go away, or do you still have it? Let's see it in the comments here in the chat.
Let's see. I also like to comment, girl, those glasses are big.
Right. Okay. So, all right. So a lot of responsibility. That makes kind of sense. But do you feel like you were thrown a little bit out to the wolves immediately, or was it kind of a ramp up period, or?
Yeah. Okay. I think that the first, say, month was more of a slow ramp up. And then it hit a point, I don't know the exact times, but then it was like, yeah, I was more thrown into stuff. I think personally, I was like, whoa, what am I doing? Like, this is a lot of responsibility. Like, I got to do well. But then at the same time, I'm not the first new PM to have ever joined the team. And I think like my manager and my team, they all knew exactly what they were doing with that. So while it seemed like a lot to me, I think like had there been areas where, and there were areas where like I needed more assistance, etc., they were happy to jump in there and sort of like guide me through that. And so, yeah, it definitely felt like that. I think it was interesting because so I've been here about 3 months, it's like next week. And the first month was, yeah, sort of a slower ramp up. The second month I was like, whoa. And then the third month, again, I was kind of like, whoa. But now it's like definitely coming more together. And I feel like I have my feet under me a little bit more. And I'm starting to sort of get to know all the people in the area that are relevant to my job, which I think is really important as PMs because it requires so much working with others. But yeah, that's sort of how the ramp up went for me.
Okay. We got some comments coming in here about imposter syndrome. Yes, I still have imposter syndrome. Never, but I got zero confidence in general. 14 years in the industry and it's still here. Yeah, there you go. I think even Scott Hanselman talks about that he's got imposter syndrome, of all people, right?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I'll have it for a while.
Yeah. And I remember from me joining the team as a program manager, I used to be a developer, and I think it took me like the transition to program manager took me like over a year, like to fully understand and get into that mind space and feel confident and comfortable. It took me a long time. I think that's normal, but maybe not normal that it takes that long. Maybe I'm just slow. I don't know.
No, I definitely think I have a lot of learning to do. And also, even when I first joined, they said it would be about 6 months. I think it probably ranges, and like maybe it's 6 months to a year. But I have a lot more learning to do before I'm like very sort of confident in my job.
Yeah. And we all learn, all the time, right? That never ends. But is it a fun journey learning all this?
Yeah, definitely. It's also so rewarding when things go well, or like, okay, I finally figured that out, or I worked with this team member and then we went through like 5 different people and figured out the issue with the users. I think it's extremely rewarding. And it's also one of the cool things about working at Microsoft is that it's such a big company. So I'm working a lot with other internal teams that use Visual Studios as a product. And so, oh, I like that comment. And so like working with these other teams and having the ability to do so, like it's a very quick process. And so it's pretty rewarding to be able to work with them and improve the experience like within a week or 2 sometimes.
Yeah. And it's not something we normally do here on this show, but let me just put in a link. So if people are interested in, joining Microsoft as a program manager or an engineer in Visual Studio or other teams, then check out the link below, careers.microsoft.com. I think in Visual Studio right now we're hiring quite significantly.
Yeah, come join our team.
Yes. Okay, that's not enough with the advertising here. That's not why we're doing what we're doing. Okay, so yeah, I'm so happy that you are on the team. I think you're doing so much great work, and the only thing I'm a little bit saddened about in these pandemic times is that you never had the pasta Wednesdays in the cafe. Yeah.
I'm also sad about that. We'll have to get it whenever we eventually go back to the office. I'm very excited for that.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna break my diet so that I can have that. That might be the thing I miss the most. The pasta Wednesdays.
Ooh, okay, that's something to look forward to. I like that.
Yes, it is not good for you, but it's great for you. Yeah, it's great for your soul, not for your body. All right, so I think we got through all the questions here. There are some questions about what a program manager's role is and what does it involve. And I would just like to tell people, go back and look at the show from sometime in September with Brady Gaster, where we talk about this and we go to much length and detail. So you don't want to miss that. So if you're not currently a college student, but maybe you're already having a job as a PM or engineer or some other related field, you want to watch the Brady Gaster interview from September. That's going to clarify it for you. Thank you so much, Kira. We're at the end, a full hour.
Awesome. I'm surprised we had enough content for that, but thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. And thank you for everyone at home. I assume you're home. Everyone is at the moment watching. It was a pleasure to get all your comments. Thank you so much. And we're not going to have this show next week because next week is the Thanksgiving weekend. And I don't know if I'm going to be working that week. I haven't decided yet. So no show, and we'll start it back up again the week after that, which brings us into the beginning of December. So stay tuned for that. And until then, have a great time. Thank you, Kira.